The chain on his wrists was not metal. It was light, a pale blue band of energy that hummed softly and tightened whenever he moved too fast. Darren Holt had never worn restraints before. He had delivered cargo and sealed documents to 31 systems in 9 years. He had eaten bad food in worse docking bays, slept in cryopods that smelled like recycled air and old plastic, and once fixed a failing engine with a piece of wire and a prayer. He had never done anything worth chaining. The chamber of the Galactic Council was enormous. The ceiling was so high it was lost in shadow. The walls curved upward in a wide arc, lined with tiered seating that held representatives from 47 species. Some had 4 arms. Some had no visible eyes. Some breathed through membranes that fluttered like flags in wind. They all looked down at him. He stood on a raised disc at the center of the floor. The disc was white and smooth, and it glowed faintly. There were no chairs. He was expected to stand. High Delegate Soren of the Voraki sat at the top tier, directly across from where Darren stood. Soren was tall even sitting. His skin was gray and scaled, his robes deep violet trimmed with gold thread. He had the look of a creature that had never been told no in its entire life. The charges were read by a translator drone hovering near Darren's left ear. Espionage, unauthorized entry into sovereign Voraki territory, interference with restricted space. Darren listened to each one. He had entered the Voraki border corridor because his navigation system had flagged a faster route while he was in emergency transit mode. The colony at Reach Station 4 was running out of blood filtration medicine. People were dying. The system had calculated the shorter path, and he had taken it. He was inside Voraki space for 11 minutes before a patrol intercepted him. The medicine was still in his cargo hold when they arrested him. He asked to speak. The translator drone relayed the request. After a pause, the council chair, a broad, flat-faced creature from the mural species, gave him 2 minutes. Darren did not raise his voice. He explained the emergency. He explained the navigation log. He explained that the medicine was verifiable, the colony's distress signal was on record, and that any reasonable review of the data would show intent was never hostile. Soren spoke before the 2 minutes were finished. His words came through the translator as smooth and final as a door closing. The intent of the human was irrelevant. The violation was recorded. The law was clear. Border intrusion during any condition was an act of trespass, and trespass into Voraki sovereign space carried 1 sentence. Darren looked up at him. His voice was quiet. He said that humanity would not forget this. Several delegates made sounds that the translator rendered as laughter. One of the mural representatives leaned toward another and exchanged words. Soren did not laugh. He simply looked at Darren the way a creature looks at something it has already decided is beneath it. The vote was taken, 31 in favor of the maximum sentence, 9 against, 7 abstentions. They did not give him a night. They processed the sentence within the hour. He was moved to a secondary chamber, smaller, with walls of dull gray and a single overhead light. A containment field was raised around him. He was told to stand still. He did. The ion disruption process was fast. That was the only mercy built into it. There was a sound like the air being pulled from the room, a flash of blue-white light brighter than anything he had ever seen, and then nothing. The whole thing was broadcast live on the galactic feed. 47 species watched it. Billions of individuals across hundreds of worlds saw a human man stand still and calm while the council ended his life for 11 minutes in the wrong star system. The broadcast ran for 6 seconds after it was over. Then the feed cut to the council spokesperson reading a short statement about the necessity of upholding interstellar law. On Earth, the signal arrived with a 4-minute delay. There were people still awake when it came through. Night shift analysts in the United Human Directorate's monitoring stations. A junior aide named Priya who had been filing reports when the alert flashed across her screen. A senior logistics coordinator named Bevan, who had worked 3 consecutive shifts and was drinking his 4th cup of cold coffee when the feed opened. Priya watched it twice. She did not cry. She picked up the secure line and called her supervisor. Bevan watched it once. He set his cup down very carefully. Then he pulled up the interdepartment priority channel and typed 4 words. "Wake everyone up now." Within 20 minutes, lights were on in buildings across 6 continents. People were being called in. Encrypted channels were being opened. The kind of meetings that never appeared in any public calendar were being scheduled for the next 3 hours. No statement was released. No ambassador was summoned to make a speech. The Directorate's Public Communications Office sent one short message to all press channels that the situation was being reviewed and a formal response would follow in due course. That was all. In the Voraki embassy on Earth, the resident diplomat Rel sent a report to Sauron before dawn. He said the humans appeared calm. He said there was no visible public reaction. He said he believed they had accepted the outcome. He was wrong about that. He was wrong in a way that would take months to fully understand. But that night, everything was quiet. The first thing the council noticed was the silence. Not silence like grief. Not silence like fear. Just the absence of the noise they expected: the protests, the angry broadcasts, the fleet mobilization alerts, the formal diplomatic threats that every other species delivered when one of their people was killed. None of it came. Rel filed 3 more reports from the Earth Embassy in the following week, each one more confused than the last. He noted that human news channels were covering the story. He noted that there were public gatherings in several cities, not riots, just people standing together, holding small lights. He noted that there were opinion pieces and debates and a great deal of human talking to each other, which he said was normal for them. But from the government, from the Directorate, from any official channel, nothing. Sauron read the reports and found them satisfying. He told his cabinet that the silence confirmed what he had believed from the start. Humans were loud and emotional until faced with a hard consequence. Then they fell quiet like every other species that had tried to test Voraki authority. He celebrated with a private dinner and moved on. What Rel was not seeing, because he was watching the surface, was everything underneath it. The United Human Directorate had 38 departments. In the 72 hours after the broadcast, all 38 of them filed emergency coordination requests, not public ones, internal ones, the kind that moved through encrypted subchannels and required biometric clearance to open. The Department of Interstellar Logistics began a quiet audit of every active contract human companies held with Council-affiliated stations and worlds. The audit was labeled a routine review. It was not routine. The Department of Economic Affairs began calculating how much of the Council's internal trade infrastructure ran on human-built systems, navigation software, cargo routing algorithms, atmospheric processors, food synthesis calibration, protocols that human engineers had developed over 40 years of working inside Council space, because they were cheaper, faster, and more reliable than anything the Council produced internally. The number was larger than even the Directorate had fully appreciated before they added it all up. 83 Council stations ran atmospheric systems with human maintenance contracts. 41 Voraki-aligned agricultural worlds used human agrochemical export formulas. The Council's primary navigation relay network had been quietly upgraded over the last decade using a human-developed signal compression system, because the original mural design kept producing errors during high traffic. None of this was secret. It was all in contracts, all legal, all documented. The Directorate looked at the number and made a decision. They began the withdrawal in stages so small that no single department of the Council would notice at first. A maintenance crew here completing its contract and not renewing. A supply shipment there arriving slightly late, then stopping with a polite notice of internal restructuring. A technical support team finishing its current obligations and then quietly redirecting its services to bilateral human partners only. Every action was legal. Every action had paperwork. Every action had a polite explanation that said nothing. The directorate also did something else. They contacted the Drevani. The Drevani were a small species, quiet traders who had existed on the edges of the council for 200 years without making enemies. They were not powerful. They were not feared. But they were trusted by almost everyone because they had never cheated anyone and had no territorial ambitions at all. They had watched the broadcast like everyone else. Their ambassador to Earth, a thin, pale creature named Uven, had sent a private message to the directorate the night of the execution that said simply, "We are sorry for what they did." The directorate replied 2 days later with a meeting request. It was not a public meeting. It happened on a human cargo vessel docked at a neutral station in the outer transit belt. No cameras, no record in any council log, just a human trade representative named Bevan, the same logistics coordinator who had sent the forward message the night of the broadcast, and Uven, sitting across a plain table in a cargo office that smelled like compressed air and machine oil. Bevan told Uven what humanity was doing and why. He said it plainly, without drama. He said human companies were going to stop providing services to council-affiliated entities until the council corrected what it had done. He said this was going to take time, and it was going to be uncomfortable for many species who had nothing to do with the vote. He said humanity was sorry for that inconvenience and wanted to offer bilateral agreements to any species willing to operate outside the council framework. Uven listened to all of it. Then he asked one question. He asked whether humanity intended to harm anyone. Bevan said no. He said no weapon would be raised. No ship would be moved into a threatening position. No species would be blockaded or sanctioned by force. He said the only thing humanity was doing was choosing where to direct its own work, its own goods, and its own people, which was a right every species in the galaxy had always had. Uven was quiet for a long moment. Then he said the Drevani would carry the message to any species that wanted to hear it. Bevan nodded and offered him a cup of coffee. It was bad coffee, the kind that came from a machine that had not been cleaned properly in several months. Uven drank it without complaint. That was the beginning of the second part of what the council would eventually call, in its own internal records, the human problem, though they had no idea yet that it had already started. The first failure was on Voraki Station Tevin 9. It was a large station, the main resupply hub for the Eastern Voraki Transit Corridor, built to handle 4,000 vessels per cycle. It had been running smoothly for 11 years, ever since a human engineering firm called HFY Systems had upgraded its atmospheric circulation network under a long-term maintenance contract. That contract had expired 6 weeks earlier. HFY Systems sent a polite notice that they would not be renewing. The notice cited internal reallocation of personnel. It offered no further explanation. The Voraki station manager had noted it in the system and flagged it for a local engineering team to take over. The local team looked at the HFY Systems design and found it difficult to follow. The documentation was complete and accurate. HFY had made sure of that because the contract required it. But the design logic was built on human engineering principles that the local team had never been trained in. They managed the basic functions well enough for the first month. Then the humidity calibration started drifting. Slowly at first, 0.5% here, 1% there. The atmospheric processors compensated automatically for a while. Then they stopped compensating because the compensation algorithm was also a HFY design, and the local team had made a small adjustment to it 3 weeks earlier to fix a different problem and had unknowingly broken a secondary function. By the time anyone noticed, the air quality in the station's central hub was causing respiratory irritation in species with sensitive breathing systems. 3 freighter crews refused to dock. 2 more filed formal complaints with the council's transit authority. The station manager sent an emergency request to Harrow Systems asking for consultation. Harrow Systems replied within 1 business day. They said they were unable to take on new service contracts at this time and wished the station well. The council's transit authority began receiving similar reports from 4 other stations within the following 2 weeks. Then the agricultural data came in. The Voraki had 7 farming worlds in their aligned territory. 3 of them used a soil treatment formula developed by a human agricultural company called Greenlane Exports, which had been providing the compound for 9 years because it increased yield rates by roughly 30% compared to native Voraki methods. Greenlane had stopped its export shipments 40 days earlier. They had notified their Voraki clients 1 full shipping cycle in advance, as their contracts required. They had offered no explanation beyond a standard business restructuring notice. The Voraki farming administrators had ordered local production of a substitute. The substitute did not work as well. The projected yield for the next harvest cycle was down 19% on all 3 worlds. 19% did not mean starvation. Not yet. But it meant the Voraki would need to increase imports from other council species to compensate, which would cost resources, which would put pressure on budgets already under strain from the station maintenance problems. The council called an emergency session. The chamber was full. Every delegate was present. The mood was tense in the way that large rooms full of creatures get tense when something they do not understand is happening to them. The Voraki presented their case. They said that a pattern of human business decisions was creating cascading failures across council infrastructure. They said it was deliberate. They said the council should issue a formal censure and demand that human companies resume their services. The human representative table was occupied by a single person. Her name was Ida Reyes. She was 63 years old. She had spent 30 years in the Directorate's trade division, and before that had worked as a structural engineer on deep space installations. She had short silver hair, dark eyes, and wore a plain dark jacket with no insignia. She did not look like a weapon. She looked like someone's grandmother who happened to be very good at her job. She waited until the Voraki finished speaking. Then she said, calmly and clearly, that human companies were conducting an internal review of their service allocations and were making business decisions in accordance with their legal rights under council commercial law, specifically sections 12 through 19 of the Interstellar Trade Autonomy Framework, which the Voraki had themselves helped draft 40 years ago. She said no human company had violated any contract. She said all departures had been carried out with the required notice periods. She said the Directorate had no authority to compel private companies to take contracts they did not wish to take. She said she was sorry for the disruption and hoped the affected stations would find suitable alternatives. Then she sat down and folded her hands on the table. The Voraki delegate demanded to know if this was retaliation for the Holt execution. Ida looked at him for a moment. She said she was not aware of any official human policy of retaliation. She said she could only speak to what was legally documented. She said if the Voraki wished to raise the matter of the execution formally, the Directorate would welcome that conversation through proper diplomatic channels. The Voraki delegate sat down. 3 other delegates, Mural, Shari, and one of the Drevani-aligned small species, asked the chair for a recess. During the recess, there were a great many private conversations in the corridors outside the chamber. Ida Reyes stayed at the human table. Someone brought her a glass of water. She drank it and read through documents on her small handheld screen. When the session resumed, the motion to formally censure humanity failed to gain enough support to reach a vote. The chair noted the result in the record. Soren, sitting at his elevated position, looked at Ida Reyes across the chamber floor. She did not look back. She was still reading her documents. He had the first real feeling he had felt in a long time, something cold and sharp that he could not name properly, something that told him this was not a thing that would resolve itself on its own. Uvin moved quietly. That was what made him good at his work. The Dravani had survived 2 centuries on the edges of galactic politics by being useful to everyone and threatening to no one. They understood that the most valuable thing a small species could offer was trustworthiness, and they had guarded that reputation with more care than they guarded their territory. He carried the human offer to 6 species in the first 3 weeks. Not to the powerful ones, not to the mural, not to the Voraki-aligned blocks, not to anyone who had a seat at the top of the council tier. He went to the ones in the middle, the species that held observer seats or junior voting rights, the ones that had been in the council long enough to know how it worked but not long enough to have their interests fully absorbed into its core machinery. He went to the Shari first. They were a species of moderate size, primarily known for precision manufacturing, who had been quietly frustrated for a decade that their trade routes were funneled through Voraki-controlled relay stations, where tariff fees kept rising without explanation. Uvin sat with their trade minister in a back room on their home station and laid out what the humans were proposing: direct bilateral agreements, no council intermediary, human logistical infrastructure made available to them on terms they negotiated themselves. The Shari trade minister listened carefully. She asked 3 specific questions about contract enforcement, dispute resolution, and what happened if the council objected. Uvin answered all 3. She signed a preliminary framework agreement 2 days later. The document was filed under a standard trade cooperation header. It looked, to anyone who scanned the council's public trade registry, like a minor logistics arrangement between a small species and a peripheral human firm. It was not minor. Uvin went to the Telin next, a species of ocean worlders who had long complained that the Council's Environmental Standards Office consistently ignored their petitions about stellar runoff from mining operations near their system. Human environmental engineering firms had the best runoff containment technology in the galaxy. They had developed it for their own deep space mining colonies and licensed it widely. But the Council's procurement process had blocked direct contracts with Telin because the Voraki had a competing and inferior environmental contractor they preferred. The Telin ambassador did not ask 3 questions. She asked 1. She asked why humans were doing this now. Uvin told her the truth. He said a human man had been killed for 11 minutes in the wrong star system while carrying medicine for dying people, and humanity had decided that was the moment to start paying attention to how much they were actually worth to the rest of the galaxy. The Telin ambassador was quiet. Then she said that she had watched the broadcast too. She said her people had a concept in their language, a word that translated roughly as the weight of what is ignored, and that she had thought about that word many times in the weeks since the execution. She signed the agreement the same day. By the end of the first month, 4 species had signed bilateral frameworks with humanity outside the council structure. By the end of the second month, 6 more had entered preliminary discussions. Each agreement was small on its own. Together they were beginning to form an alternative network, not a rival to the council, not a military alliance, just a web of practical arrangements that did not need council approval to function. The council noticed. Soren brought it to the floor during a regular session. He called it an attempt by humanity to fracture galactic unity. He said the bilateral agreements were a deliberate strategy to undermine council authority. He called for a resolution condemning the practice and requiring all member species to route their trade agreements through council-approved channels. The resolution required a 2/3 majority. He got 11 votes. 19 species abstained, 4 voted against. Several of the abstentions came from species that had previously voted reliably with Voraki positions. When Soren looked at the names on the abstention list, he recognized 3 of them as species currently in preliminary discussions with the Drevani network. He requested a private meeting with the mural chair after the session. The mural chair was old, heavy-faced, deliberate in the way of creatures that had held power long enough to stop enjoying it. He told Soren plainly that the resolution had failed because many delegates did not want to restrict their own trade autonomy in response to a situation the Voraki had created. He said the execution of the human courier had been, in his personal opinion, unnecessary. He said he had not said so publicly because he had not wanted to embarrass the Voraki at the time. He said things were different now. Soren returned to his offices and called for a full briefing from his economic analysis team. They presented their projections in a room with no outside communications active. The projections were not good. The Voraki economic model relied heavily on being the preferred intermediary for trade between council species and human suppliers. If species began sourcing directly from humans, the Voraki transit fees, tariff income, and preferred contractor status would all erode simultaneously. They were already eroding. The team showed him numbers going back 8 weeks. The curve was not dramatic. It was slow and steady, and it was pointing in one direction. Soren sat with the report for a long time after his team left. He had voted for the maximum sentence because Darren Holt had violated Voraki space, and an example needed to be made. He had expected humanity to react with noise and then subside, the way every other species did when they ran into a wall they could not move. He was beginning to understand that humanity had not tried to move the wall. They had simply started building their own road around it, one small legal agreement at a time, and they had been doing it quietly from the night of the broadcast, while his ambassador on Earth was filing reports about how calm everything seemed. He pulled up Ida Ray's personnel file from the Council's public diplomatic registry. He read it slowly. Then he requested a private meeting with the human delegation. No official agenda, no record in the Council log. Her reply came in 4 hours. She agreed. The room Soren chose was small by Voraki standards, a secondary conference space on level 4 of the Council complex, used mostly for low-level administrative meetings. No recording systems, no attendance. He had personally confirmed with station security that the corridor outside would be cleared for the duration. He arrived first and waited. Ida Ray's arrived 2 minutes after the agreed time with a single aide, a young human man who carried a case of documents and then stood near the door without speaking. She sat across the table from Soren and placed her hands flat on the surface and looked at him. Soren began by saying that he wished to understand what humanity wanted. Ida said that was a reasonable thing to want. She told him clearly, without preamble, humanity required 4 things. First, a full public admission by the Galactic Council that Darren Holt had been innocent of any hostile intent and that his execution had been a misapplication of the law. Second, a formal apology entered into the Galactic Record under the Council's official seal. Third, the dissolution or revision of the border trespass statute under which he had been sentenced, specifically to include provisions for humanitarian emergency navigation. Fourth, a new framework granting human citizens full protected diplomatic status, equivalent to Voraki citizens when present in Council space. Soren listened to all 4 without interrupting. Then he said the demands were excessive. He said the Council could not publicly reverse a legal judgment without undermining the authority of every judgment it had ever made. He said a formal apology would be seen by every species in the galaxy as a sign of weakness. Ida looked at him. She said she understood his concern. She said that was why humanity had not issued any ultimatums, made any threats, or moved a single ship into a position that could be interpreted as aggressive. She said humanity had simply been making business decisions, and it would continue making those same decisions, perfectly legally, with full documentation, indefinitely. She said there was no deadline and no expiration on the directorate's patience. Soren said she was describing economic coercion. Ida said she was describing a species choosing where to direct its own labor and resources. She said if the Voraki wished to file a formal complaint about human business practices, the directorate would respond through proper channels, and that the review process under council commercial law typically took between 4 and 7 years. Soren was quiet. Ida let the silence sit. He asked her, after a moment, whether she understood what a public reversal would do to the Voraki position in the council. He said the Voraki had built 40 years of authority on the principle of consistent enforcement. He said what she was asking him to do was stand in front of the entire galaxy and say they had been wrong. Ida said yes. She said that was exactly what she was asking. She said the reason she was asking it was that they had been wrong, and that, in her experience, wrong things did not get better by being left alone. She said something else then, quietly, almost as an aside. She said she had read the medical records from Reach Station 4. She said that by the time the Voraki patrol intercepted Darren Holt's vessel, 11 people on that station had already died from blood filtration failure. She said 31 more were saved by the medicine in his cargo hold, which was delivered by a different courier 4 days after his arrest. She said the station's medical director had filed a testimony during the trial that the council had not entered into the formal record. She slid a document across the table. Soren looked at it for a moment and did not pick it up. She said she was not trying to make him feel guilty. She said guilt was a human emotion, and she was not sure it translated across species. She said she was simply ensuring that he had the full set of facts. He picked up the document. He read it slowly. His face, which was not built for the kind of expressions humans used, did something that Ida could not fully read. His breathing membrane stilled. She waited. He said, finally, that he would need to bring the terms to the full council. He said he could not commit to any of it on his own authority. Ida said she understood completely. She said the directorate was prepared to wait. Soren stood. He was much taller than her standing. He looked down at her and she looked back up at him, and there was a long pause in which nothing was said. He asked her, quietly, if humanity had planned all of this from the night of the broadcast. She said the broad outlines had been in place within 72 hours. He asked how a species coordinates that kind of response so quickly. She thought about it for a moment. Then she said that humans had a long history of being told their lives were worth less than other people's rules. She said they had become very good at knowing what to do when that happened. She picked up her things and nodded to her aide. She said she hoped the council's deliberations went smoothly. She said the directorate looked forward to a productive relationship with all council species, including the Voraki, once the current situation was resolved. Then she left. Soren stood in the empty room for a while. He looked at the document on the table. He picked it up again and read the last paragraph of the medical director's testimony, the part that explained how many people would have died without the medicine that Darren Holt had been carrying when they arrested him. He set it down carefully. Outside in the corridor, Ida and her aide walked without speaking until they reached the elevator. The aide asked if she thought Soren would bring the terms to the council. Ida said yes. He asked how she knew. She said that, in her experience, people who ask how something was planned are people who have already decided they were beaten. They just need time to make peace with it. The elevator doors closed. The council deliberated for 3 days behind closed doors. No external communications were logged during that time. The chamber was sealed under the standard closed session protocol that the council used for matters it considered internally sensitive. Delegates came and went from the complex with their faces unreadable, which was easy for most of them since very few had faces capable of the kind of expression that would give something away. What came out later, piece by piece through the accounts of junior aides and administrative staff who had overheard portions of the arguments, was that the first day had been difficult. Several Voraki-aligned delegates pushed hard against the terms. They used the same argument Soren had used with Ida, that revering the judgment would damage council authority. They proposed alternatives: a quiet, off-record acknowledgement with no public broadcast, a partial revision of the border statute without the formal apology, a compromise framework for human diplomatic status that fell short of full equivalence. Each alternative was put to a preliminary count. Each one failed to reach majority because species that might have voted with the Voraki bloc 6 months ago were now calculating differently. They were looking at their own numbers. They were looking at what bilateral access to human services had already meant for the species that had signed agreements, and what continued exclusion from that access would mean for them. The Tellan delegate, the ocean worlder whose people had been waiting years for the runoff containment technology, said something during the second day that several people remembered afterward. She said that the council had been founded on the principle that no species should face injustice without recourse. She said a human man had faced injustice in this chamber and had been given no recourse. She said the question before them was not about authority or appearances. It was about whether they were willing to be what they claimed to be. The room was quiet after that for a long time. The vote on the final day was not close: 38 in favor of accepting all 4 human terms, 6 against, 3 abstentions. The 6 against were all Voraki-aligned delegates. The Voraki themselves abstained. Soren had not voted in favor, but he had chosen not to vote against. It was a distinction that everyone in the chamber noticed and no one mentioned aloud. The public broadcast was prepared by the Council's communications office. It aired on the same galactic feed that had carried the execution, the same channel, the same broadcast header, the same planetary distribution list. Several communications officers had quietly ensured that part. It seemed important to them that it be the same channel. The council chair read the statement. It was precise and formal in the way of official documents, but it was not vague. It named Darren Holt by name. It said he had been acting in humanitarian emergency conditions. It said the trial had failed to properly weigh the evidence of his intent. It said the execution had been a misapplication of council law and that the council accepted full responsibility for that outcome. It said his name would be entered into the galactic record under the category of wrongful death, with a notation that he had been carrying medical supplies for a dying colony at the time of his arrest. It said humanity was owed an apology, and that the council offered one without reservation. The broadcast ran for 4 minutes. When it was finished, there was no music, no closing statement, no spokesperson. It simply ended. 3 days after the broadcast, a delegation of council engineers and a team from Harrow Systems met on Voraki Station Tevin 9 to begin reviewing the atmospheric system. The contract terms had been renegotiated from scratch. The new agreement included a training component. Human engineers would work alongside local teams and document their methods in formats accessible to non-human technical staff. It was Ida's suggestion. She had included it in a follow-up memo to the council without being asked. She had noted that the goal was not to make council species dependent on human expertise but to share it, and that the difference mattered. The directorate sent a representative to oversee the placement of the memorial in the council chamber. It was a simple thing: a flat dark stone set into the floor near the center disc, with Darren Holt's name cut into it and 2 lines of text beneath. The text said he had been a courier. It said he had been carrying medicine. Every species voted to approve the memorial, including the Voraki. Ida gave one public address after the resolution was complete. It was short. She spoke from a small room in the human diplomatic suite on the council station, with no backdrop, no flags, nothing formal behind her. She said that humanity had not sought to punish anyone or to claim superiority over any species. She said they had sought correction of a wrong, and they had pursued it through every means available to them that did not involve harming others. She said they would always do that. She said that was not a threat, it was simply a description of who humans were. She said she hoped the Council and humanity would work together more honestly going forward. Then she thanked no one and said nothing else. In a small office on a Drevani trading station, Uven watched the address on a personal screen. He was making notes in a journal he kept by hand, an old habit. He was writing about the weeks of quiet meetings, the bilateral agreements, the vote that had changed, the moment the tide had turned without a single gun being raised. He wrote for a while, and then stopped and looked at what he had written. He had been trying to explain it, what humanity had done and how they had done it, and he kept finding that every explanation he wrote felt incomplete. He crossed out 2 paragraphs. He thought about it more. Then he wrote one line that felt closer to true than anything else he had tried. He wrote, "They did not fight for the dead man. They proved that losing him had cost something real, and they were very patient about letting everyone else figure out the rest." He looked at the line for a moment. Then he closed the journal and went to make tea. Outside the station viewport, a human cargo freighter was docking. Its running lights blinked slow and steady in the dark. It was carrying medicine.